Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest statement from the EU Commissioner for the Internal Market, Thierry Breton, who has said that he does not think that the Brexit deal should be changed just to satisfy one category in the industry. He's talking about the car industry relating to rules of origin for electric vehicles. The public argument against an extension to grace periods on electric vehicles is certainly an indication that Rishi Sunak's got a lot of work to do if he is to avoid the cliff edge of tariffs being applied this January and the risks to thousands of jobs in Britain. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So there have been a lot of things in the political news this week, but Brexit very much one of them, as it's the weekend of the second National Rejoin March. Let's kick off with a few of the EU-themed political stories in Britain. But I must point out, first of all, that those planning on attending the march tomorrow, the start location has been changed slightly. It's still in roughly the same place. It's now going to be from the Hilton Hotel rather than the Statue of Achilles. Apparently the parks had an issue. But anyway, back to the Brexit news. And this first one is very much about the competitiveness of the British car industry. Now, like the fishing industry, the car industry is notable for being a particular target for Brexiteers in 2016. They convinced people living in industrial and fishing towns alike that their industry would boom after leaving the EU. Rather cruel deception, because they both suffered quite badly on balance. The car industry arguably more so, I suppose, than fishing, because there are absolutely no upsides at all for them. Like, some fishermen have gained from the new Brexit arrangements. It's just that the industry as a whole in this country is now less valuable. But I haven't been able to identify any part of the car industry in Britain that has actually gained anything from Brexit. And the obligatory reminder that the Tories' favourite economist, Professor Sir Patrick Minford, made it clear that not only would the car industry not survive Brexit, but that the government should not even try to save it. The reason is ultimately supply chains. In order to have a competitive manufacturing industry on the world stage, you need efficient supply chains. You need to be able to get components cheap so that you can then sell the end product competitively. You know, it's not possible to supply yourself with everything you need inside one country, even a relatively sizable economy like the UK. For example, some components, they're not needed in large enough quantities to justify factories all over Europe. So you may have one or two that produce them cheaply thanks to economies of scale. In fact, Breton was pointing out that the car industry is not the big car manufacturers, because what's happening at the moment is, for those who aren't aware, at the moment, electric vehicles don't really meet rules of origin because we don't actually produce the batteries needed for them in here or in the EU. Like Europe in general, it's catching up with the infrastructure needed. So there isn't enough of an electric vehicle made in either the EU or Britain that meets rules of origin. So whenever they're sold to the other market, there's going to be, at the moment, there's no tariffs on them because there was a grace period. Brexit's implemented in stages. But from this January, there's going to be 10% tariffs on them until such time as we can actually manufacture our own cells, really. And it's the major car manufacturers that are raging against this. In both Britain and the EU, by the way, the old German car manufacturers as well. So they're saying, well, hang on a minute, we don't want these tariffs applied to our goods, so can we have an extension, please? And Breton was pointing out that the car industry is not just the big car manufacturers. It's the entire supply chain, including, he said, those who manufacture the batteries for electric vehicles. And his argument is that the EU should not be acting to just please the big manufacturers if it comes at a cost of investment in supply chains inside the EU. See, over the past few decades, we've built up a large, efficient supply chain spanning Europe, but leaving the single market now means we've sort of broken ourselves off from it. We've got trade friction. We can't get components as quickly. We can't say, can we have these things delivered in 2 days? It's like, might take a few weeks, mate. And there are extra costs as a result of customs and standards divergence as well. You know, Brexiteers are going loopy right now because Keir Starmer was just recorded saying that divergence is the cause of a lot of our extra costs and trade friction. But that is correct. It is. We've already had to hand over larger state aid subsidies to manufacturers in order to bribe them to set up here. Basically, in order to have a car industry once the electric vehicle revolution is in full swing in a few years. For all Sunak's talk of delaying this transition on the tariffs, and on net zero and on delays to the bans on petrol and diesel cars and all the rest of it, his government is spending heavily on bribing manufacturers to set up in Britain. But all that investment will count for very little if we can't sell competitively. A country needs to export. You don't make much selling to yourself. We need to sell to the European market. As of this January, because we can't meet rules of origin for electric vehicles at this time, we're going to find our exports being slapped with 10% tariffs. And because we're going to be producing more and more electric vehicles over the next few years, until we have those supply chains established, at least somewhere in Europe, we're going to continue to pay 10% tariffs. And so, by the way, so much for the tariff-free deal with the EU that Boris Johnson insisted he had. I said all along, it's complete lies. It's only tariff-free under certain conditions. This is one of the conditions we're not meeting. So we don't have a tariff-free deal. That was a lie. And that lie risks being exposed in a pretty major way this January. At the moment, I don't think there's really that much discussion in what you might call the proper mainstream media, the popular mainstream media. But if we don't get an extension, there's going to have to be come January. It's going to have to be in the news, and people are going to say, hang on a minute, I thought we had a tariff-free deal here. Sunak has said he wants to negotiate an extension to the grace periods on EVs. There are some in the EU who support this move as well, because the same deadline that will screw British exports will also screw EU exports, and it's a lot of exports. But there are others in the EU who think that going ahead with the original deadlines will encourage more investment in the EU. Because remember, when Tata agreed to build their EV battery factory in the UK, as opposed to Spain, remember that? Oh, how the Brexiteers cheered, despite the massive cost to the taxpayer. But this is exactly the sort of move which is hardening attitudes by some within the EU. The UK is now a third country. We chose to be so, a competitor. The EU acts in the interests of its members. Well, that used to be us, not anymore. They don't want to see investment go into Britain over the EU anymore. So there was a time when it didn't matter. Oh, investment in the UK or Spain doesn't matter. It's all the EU. Now it's not. So they don't want to see investment that could go to the EU going to Britain any more than people in Britain want to see the reverse. If the tariffs go ahead, it will make British produced EVs 10% more expensive. It makes it a tougher sell to persuade manufacturers to set up factories in Britain. It would make more sense to set them up in the EU. And that's the argument by people like Breton in the EU. You know, if our EVs are 10% more expensive, it simply means we won't be able to sell as many. Production will close in Britain, and not completely, but, you know, it will scale back. Some factories will close and be forced to move to the EU, as has happened in lots of industries already. Like, remember, in the start of 2021, we left the single market, right? Lots of businesses were contacting the government saying, how do we cope with this? We don't know how to cope with this. And the government advice to those businesses whose customers were in the EU, or a sizable number were in the EU, the government's advice was, why don't you shift investment from Britain to the EU, set up in the single market? That was our extreme Tory Brexit's government's advice to people after we left the single market. Well, it should come as no surprise that there are going to be people in the EU who want that pressure to apply to as many industries as possible. Now, I don't know whether an extension will be agreed or not. My magic 8 ball seems unclear. There are influential voices calling for an extension, but there are influential voices arguing against. I don't know which side it will win out. Maybe it will be a typical EU compromise where an extension is agreed, but quite a short one. Don't know. What I do know is that those arguing against an extension have a strong argument in favour of their long-term investment. I also know that if the view which emerges is one of sticking to the current arrangements, then there are going to be a lot of negative headlines about Brexit in a few months. If Sunak is planning on a snap election this autumn, we don't know. Perhaps he thinks this will then just be a problem for Labour, won't it? Like everything else he's storing up for Labour. Maybe. But what is clearer is that Labour or Conservatives in power, when this hits, it will certainly be a Brexit problem. It will be undeniable that the problem has only arisen because of Brexit. Labour will point to the fact that it's also a direct result of the weak Tory Brexit deal. which they will then have to work to try and strengthen. After all, Sunak is currently engaged in trying to change this aspect of our trade and cooperation agreement. So even the Tories recognise that the deal doesn't suit us. They're trying to claim, oh no, it's only in hindsight, it was absolutely fine. It was absolutely fine at the time. No, it wasn't. It was never fine. But if job losses are announced, they will be Brexit job losses. Might be Labour's problem to deal with if we get that snap election, but it will be the Tories' fault, and it will absolutely, definitely be Brexit's fault. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.